Welcome back to Getting Out of Our Own Way, Making Friends with Ego and Resistance on the Spiritual Path. Today we're going to talk about what is the ego and how and why it creates resistance. The big question is, who is the I, who is the me that gets in my own way? And we'll be looking, particularly next week, at these different layers or different aspects of the self. But right now, we're going to look at the egoic self, that me that can really get in my own way. But that whole question of who am I is the universal question, isn't it? Ramana Maharshi, an Indian master of the last century, said the only mantra one ever needs is the mantra, who am I? That if we ask this question again and again, that answers beyond our expectations will arise. But in Western thinking and in Western psychology, we do tend to like to define things. So we ask the question, who am I? But we look at what are the structures of the self? What are the structures of me, of my identity? And two definitions of ego that I particularly like. The first is the ego is the self, especially as distinct from the world and other selves. Makes sense. Okay, so this is the me, that's the ego, my sense of me-ness that is different from you, that's different from objects, that's different, that has actually different thought processes than you, or has sometimes different physical composition than the object. So that's me, separate. In psychoanalysis, this is the second definition, it's the division of the psyche that is conscious, most immediately controls thought and behavior, and is most in touch with external reality. So the ego is our mediator, it is our negotiator, it is that which is connected through the senses with taking in the outside world. The beauty of having this me is that I am not simply diffuse consciousness. I learn how to negotiate in time and space. Therefore, I don't bump into you, or I don't bump into this object in front of me. Similarly, actually, with the way the ego contains our thoughts, if you will, so that my thoughts are not connected up with your thoughts, and there isn't this jumble of who's thinking what. Interesting when we take that a little bit further, because many of us have a kind of intuitive sense, perhaps, of what other people are thinking and feeling. But for the most part, we still retain that sense of me as separate. That's our ego. So, as we talked a little bit about ego last time, you see, as a separate entity, the ego really works to protect itself. It's constantly scanning the environment through the senses to look for any kind of potential threat so that it can sustain its integrity, its selfhood, so to speak. And this is very functional. We do need this. I need to see this object in front of me so that I don't trip over it. The ego is also scanning for emotional and psychological threat, making sure that you're being nice to me. And maybe it learns I need to be nice to you in order for you to be nice to me back. So the ego, again, helps us to interact with people and to negotiate relationships. The thing is about the ego that it really kind of likes being a solo act. It likes its sense of separateness. It likes its sense of self-identity. In the Indian yogic tradition, there's a beautiful teaching principle called a teaching nyaya about the ocean and the wave. The ocean, the vast ocean, is like universal consciousness. This is the divine. It is cosmic intelligence. It is actually the substrate of everything. It is the ground of being, so to speak. But all oceans on their surface have waves that rise up from movement and current within that great absolute. As a wave rises up, it celebrates its own individuality. It's like, I have this moment in the sun and I'm going to wave at it. I might want to make a big splash. I might want to just have a nice little peaceful ride. This is the ego, if you will, in comparison to the absolute, in comparison to, if you will, diffuse and formless intelligence. This form arises, at least it's an apparent form, for a while, and then eventually it dissolves back in. Well, that's what our ego doesn't want to do. It doesn't want to dissolve back in. You can see where this gets to be a problem with spiritual practice, because in spiritual practice, what is it that actually happens? We experience ourselves as something greater. There's this sense of loss of my identity of self, at least for a brief time. The ego can begin to resist that. And it'll do it in all kinds of forms. One might be by telling you that you're just too busy to sit down and do your meditation practice, you see. Or it might tell you you really can't do that. Or it might tell you, this isn't really true. You are not part of that universal. How dare you consider yourself to be divine within? You're just this little small splat on the face of the earth, or you're just this little drop that flies loose from the ocean. Because the ego, as much as it really strives to survive, it also knows that it's actually rather small in the world, if you will. And it doesn't like that. It makes it feel very inferior. It doesn't feel very good about that. So sometimes it compensates and tries to tell you and tell everybody else that it's really big and really important. And it goes about proving that by acquiring all kinds of things in the world, status, material objects, etc. And that's part of what the ego does, right? It's trying to support your sense of identity. So at some level, the ego is actually threatened by its own divine nature. And that's so interesting, because when you think about the ocean and the wave, right? The wave is only the water. It's all water. But for those moments when the wave gets to appear, it wants to be only the wave and is terribly threatened by being what it really is. It will not look, it refuses to look at its own true nature, which is actually something much greater than it appears as ego. But the ego has other jobs too. In psychoanalysis, as I'm sure most of you know, the ego is the moderator between the id and the superego. The id are all those impulses and desires. We talked a little bit about shenpas last time. They're all those impulses and desires, all those things that I want to do. If I'm angry, I want to strike out. If I'm hungry, I want to eat a mountain. And then all those shoulds and shouldn'ts of the superego. You should be a good girl. You should do this. You need to follow all these rules. And if you follow all these rules, you'll just be fine. And so the ego is struggling to balance out between these admonitions and these desires. It's actually hard work on the ego. And the ego doesn't get that much support. So it gets anxious. It gets depressed. gets a little neurotic, if you will. And again, because it's striving to maintain its own separateness, its own individuality in the face of, it's really not that. It really is the ocean. So it's a struggle. And it's a hard struggle. So the ego puffs itself up and it continues to move on. And sometimes even it can get a little menacing and it can get a little manipulative in order to keep its way or to keep itself up on the surface of the ocean longer than the other waves around it. It wants this stable sense of identity, you see. But the ego is made out of that great consciousness. There is nothing but the divinity. There is nothing but true consciousness, absolute consciousness. We are all made of God stuff, if you will. And yet we fight it. We fight knowing that. We fight believing that. We fight experiencing that. Because we want to be just like we are. And we want everybody else around us to stay just like they are. And then everything's predictable and controllable. So if you start to do something I didn't expect, I'm going to put you right back in your place, especially if it's something that I could perceive as threat. And then the ego goes about manipulating and moving things in a way to get what it says it wants. The ego can be really harsh on itself and on the world around it. Very judging, very critical, full of jealousy, a lack of compassion for itself and others. And even though it's working to try to keep us intact, we often don't feel very good. We give in to that anxiety, to that depression that comes as a result of trying to maintain this separateness. You see, it really leads towards alienation, if you will. And actually, it's pervasive in our Western culture. The ego is, at some level, it's responsible for the entire scientific paradigm of rational materialism because it insists that something only exists if we can reach out and touch it, we can smell it, feel it, and measure it. The ego cannot accept even that there's any proof of God. For that matter, maybe not even of love. Because it's not right there, right where I can touch it. Fortunately, the new paradigm in physics, which understands exactly what we're talking about with consciousness, that energy is always in flux, that intelligence is actually always in flux, and that there really is not materiality as we have understood it to be. So physics is telling us now, you know what? We think we're touching that. We think we're smelling that. But there is no that there. That which we see, I'm looking at a couch. And that which I see is couchness at some level, but it's pure energy. It's the movement of energy. It's not even the movement of particles. Is it the movement of waves? Actually, what is energy? It's the movement of the divine universal. And fortunately, our science is catching up with what the yogis have taught us for thousands of years. Now, is our ego catching up with that? Not quite. That's why we have to prepare it, work with it, give it time to steep in meditative practices. Again, the ego gets really scared. It's threatened by its own demise. That's its biggest threat. And when we have a spiritual experience and there seems to be this temporary loss of self, that can be a scary thing. So when we do our spiritual practices, when we take those moments to just steep in and to ask, who am I? And to feel that deep I-ness within, What we're actually doing is we're preparing our body-mind, we're preparing our ego to accept and to take in that we are nothing but that universal energy. We are nothing but that universal life force, if you will. I want to read to you something from the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is an ancient and wonderful text from the Hindu tradition, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's one of the most widely read books in the world. And the Bhagavad Gita is the story of Arjuna, who is a great warrior. And he is about to do battle, a huge battle, and he recognizes that those people that he is about to fight, some of them are his cousins, but these are people that he has known. And although he's been a great warrior, he has doubts. He starts talking to his charioteer, who turns out later to be Krishna, a manifestation of God. And he's asking him, why should I do this? And Krishna's listening to him and talking to him and basically says, you know what, you can't be a conscientious objector here in life. You have to participate in life. This is actually your role. And besides, he tells him, at a higher level, all these beings are already dead. You didn't kill them. I did. The great consciousness. What he's saying is, every wave has already dissolved into the ocean many, many times. It may rise up again, but it will dissolve again. But the part I want to read to you is a very famous chapter from chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita, in which Arjuna is recognizing who Krishna is, that he is the great absolute. And he says, do you suppose I could see you as you really are? Krishna's not quite so sure. The question is he prepared? Is he prepared? Is Arjuna prepared to actually not just dissolve into that ocean, but to become the ocean? It's kind of a scary prospect. And Krishna says, okay, well, in order for you to do that, I'm going to have to give you can't do it with your worldly eyes. You can't do it with your egoic eyes. I'm going to have to give you a sacred eye. And he gives him a lovely third eye. And as that eye opens up, Arjuna looks in to the face of God. More specifically, he looks into the mouths of God. So I'm going to just read to you. So this is just at the very beginning, where Krishna had been telling Arjuna about what he is, that Krishna is the great absolute. And Arjuna asks, just as you have described your infinite glory, O Lord, now I long to see. I want to see you as the supreme ruler of creation. This is when Krishna says, okay, fine, but I'm going to give you a different eye so that you can see this. And then he appeared with an infinite number of faces, ornamented by heavenly jewels, displaying unending miracles and countless weapons of power. Clothed in celestial garments and covered with garlands, sweet-smelling with heavenly fragrances, he showed himself as the infinite Lord, the source of all wonders, whose face is everywhere. Seeing him, Arjuna says, if 1,000 suns were to rise in the heavens at the same time, the blaze of their light would resemble the splendor of that supreme spirit. You are the supreme, changeless reality, the one thing to be known. You are the refuge of all creation, the immortal spirit, the eternal guardian of the Dharma. You are without beginning, middle, or end. You touch everything with your infinite power. The sun and the moon are your eyes, and your mouth is fire. Your radiance warms the cosmos. This is where I want you to pay attention, because it gets a little overwhelming, a little overpowering, a little scary for Arjuna. Oh, Vishnu, I can see your eyes shining. With open mouth, you glitter in an array of colors, and your body touches the sky. I look at you and my heart trembles. I have lost all courage and all peace of mind. When I see your mouths with their fearful teeth, mouths burning like the fires at the end of time, I forget where I am and I have no place to go. O Lord, you are the support of the universe. Have mercy upon me. I forget where I am and I have no place to go. There is no I left when I am dissolved in the absolute. There is no I left when I am the great ocean of consciousness. This is what the ego resists. This is what scared Arjuna. Now, eventually, Arjuna was able to handle the experience, but he had to go back to ordinary consciousness, and he had to go back and he had to fight the war. Just like each and every one of us, right? We can have these glimpses, we can have this connection, but we will come back into this body, into this being, and we will have to continue to negotiate this life. So often when we have these experiences or these glimpses into unity consciousness, into that dissolution, into the ocean of consciousness, often we're not all that well prepared for them, and we're certainly not all that well prepared to suddenly rise up in our egoic sense again and go back out there in the world. So we need a spiritual practice that will kind of strengthen our muscle, in our spiritual muscles, in order to be able to go back and forth between the outward flow of attention and the inward flow of attention. And that practice, as I do it and teach it, is the practice of meditation. This is what meditation does for us. We take some time each day, twice a day preferably, where we sit in that space that we can approach the universal, where we sit in that pure I-ness, and then we pulsate back out. And actually, during any given meditation session, we move back and forth between those two poles. We're thinking, and then we come back into someplace deeper. So meditation is a practice that we can think of ourselves sort of like Arjuna as spiritual warriors that's going to strengthen the muscles so that the ego begins to understand in time that, no, it's not being completely snuffed out, if you will. We're not going to kill the ego. We need the ego. We want to make friends with it. We need it to help us negotiate this world of solid objects and this world of other people. So this is how we begin to make friends with it, by dipping in a couple of times a day to that place that is deeper, that is more universal, and then coming back out. And we do this over and over and over again. And soon, just like a baby begins to get a sense of object constancy and begins to learn that even though mom may be gone in this moment, it doesn't mean she's going to be gone forever. The ego begins to learn, oh, okay, I may not have a sense of myself for a few moments, but I'll be back. And as a matter of fact, I can melt into that. I can actually begin to rest into it. I don't have to be so vigilant in those moments of practice. I don't have to be so worried about all those demands of the id and the super ego. And I can just rest a little bit. I can relax. We can actually become a little less neurotic and a little less anxious when we let ourselves dip in and then come back out. So this piece about making sure that we understand that we're not trying to snuff out the ego is very important. There actually are some meditation practices that you'll hear about that are all about, we've got to get rid of the ego, get rid of the ego, get rid of the ego, kill the ego, no ego allowed. And what I'm arguing here is that that's not it. The ego is part of who we are. Actually, the ego is made out of what everything else is made out of, right? It is made out of that God stuff. It is made out of that universal energy. And it does serve a purpose. When it's threatened, it may kind of exaggerate its purpose and its power and its necessity and its potency. But when it can simply relax, it can actually begin to feel the benefits of our meditation practice. It can actually enjoy the times of rest. The ego will actually begin to seek these experiences too. Then we're more in harmony. Then we're more aligned. So what I'd like to do right now is I want to lead you in a guided meditation that can also be your part of your contemplation for the upcoming week. And that is the meditation we're going to use Who Am I as a mantra. And you can do this at home aloud, or you can do it silently in your mind. But what I'd like to ask you to do right now is go ahead and close your eyes and just come into your breath. Take a deep inhalation and a deep exhalation. Feel yourself rooting and grounding into the chair or the floor that you're sitting in. If you're laying down in bed, it'd be great to be seated, but you can stay wherever you are. And just begin to let the question, who am I, pulsate through your mind. Like a silent mantra, you simply ask again and again, who am I? Don't ask it too quickly, not too slowly, just find a nice rhythm. Give a little rest in between, give space in between the repetitions of who am I. It's good when you're at home and practicing this on your own to try to do it maybe 9 times. Who am I? Again, giving space in between, noticing when the thoughts start to wander, when you begin to think about your dinner or what your next task is, and then just ask again, who am I? And then after 9 times, we're going to change the inflection. So this time, you're going to ask yourself, who am I? Pause. Who am I? Pause again. 9 times. Who am I? When you've reached 9 times, we're going to change the inflection once more. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And yet another change of inflection. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? So as you practice this during the week, remember there are 4 sets of 9. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And it doesn't matter if answers appear or not. Just give it space. And then I'd like you to think about a couple of other questions. I'd like you to recall a time when you actually deliberately set out to lose yourself, to dissolve yourself. See, I've been talking so far about how when it happens through spiritual practice and how sometimes we actually deliberately want that to happen, but now I'm thinking about something else. Notice during the week when you do this, the ego gets really tired. It works hard. And so sometimes it just wants to lose itself. Watching TV, watching a movie, playing a video game, drinking alcohol, drugs. How is it in your own individual situation that you will deliberately set out to lose your mind, so to speak, to lose your ego? And then I want you to think about a time where this has happened to you by virtue of grace, by spiritual practice, where there was this sense of dissolution. And notice if you ever had any of that kind of holy terror, where it was actually a little scary. Notice the difference then, discern the difference between these two situations when we deliberately set out to blot out our mind, so to speak, and when through spiritual experience we have that sense of merger and dissolution. And just think about how those two things may be different for you in your experience. One occurs by virtue of the ego, one occurs by virtue of grace.